It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. I'd like to thank Kim Huggins for being here with us today. Kim has a passion for driving business strategy while forming valuable relationships at all organizational levels. Her extensive experience, focus on execution, and enthusiastic approach has helped to transform diverse companies in various industries, whether they are Fortune 50 corporations or small startups. Kim is a nationally recognized thought leader on the topic of generational diversity in the workplace. She is also the author of Generate Performance: Unleashing the Power of a Multi-Generational Workforce. This book offers strategies for business executives to embrace change, inspire employees from all generations, and lead with confidence. I'm sure it is evident why Kim was selected as an executive education faculty member for our recently piloted and very well received mini MBA in intergenerational leadership. Welcome to the faculty, Kim, as well as to today's webinar. And please take it from here.
Great, thank you so much, Margaret, and hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you about really a very important business issue. So the next 45 minutes or so, let me just talk about what we plan to go through. Start off just reviewing who are the 5 generations. There's actually 5 generations now that are in the workplace, and also for many of you in business, you may have 5 generations of customers. So we want to just set the foundation of the discussion to talk about, what's happened from generation to generation that has helped shape their core values and what's important to them. And then we're going to talk about some shifts that are taking place, some pretty significant shifts that are taking place in the workplace demographics, and the impact that that's having on businesses and companies. And I'll tell you a little bit about what some companies are doing to address the multi-generations, their preferences, and to plan for some of these shifts that are happening. It's interesting. I've been speaking and training on this topic for many years now, and I will tell you, in the past couple of years, this has really become an issue that more and more of our clients are talking about and experiencing and reaching out for help. And I really believe that that is in big part because of the demographic shifts. And I'm going to share with you a couple of our clients' data so that you can see just how these shifts are happening, and then we'll talk about the impact of those. And also give you, at the end, some strategies that you can immediately use. So let's just start off by talking about who are the generations, because there's lots of different labels that are used for them, but these are the ones that we use, and so I'll just kind of walk through them and tell you a little bit about the years that they were born and how old they are. So the traditionalist generation is currently the oldest generation in the workplace. So they were born between the years of 1910, 1945. Some people and some literature refers to them as the silent generation or the veteran generation. So they're currently age 74 and above. Then we have the baby boom generation, born between 1946 to 1964. So they're between the ages of 55 to 73. Generation X, who was born between 1965 and 1980. They're currently ages 39 to 54. The millennial generation, also referred to as Generation Y, born between 1981 and 2000, and they are between 19 and 38. And then the youngest generation right now, who has been labeled Generation Z, born between 2001 and 2019, and they're currently age 0 to 18. We also have a term that we use in this space called cuspers, and those are people that are on the cusp of one generation, between one generation and another. So they may, for example, be at the older age of Gen X, cusping on the baby boom generation, and so we call that cusper. And they're important in the workplace because they often have some shared values of both generations. So I just mentioned that because some of you may have heard of that, or some of you may say, as we go through this, I can see myself in more than one of these generations, and so you may be a cusper. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that have shaped each generation. And there's been a lot of research that's been done on this topic. And basically what the research has shown is that during each generation's formative years, so that's from birth to age 18, things that were happening during that time, wars that were taking place, things that were happening within the family unit, within the workplace, ultimately helped to shape each generation's core values and their personalities. And that is not to say that within each generation, everyone is the same. We're certainly not trying to put people into a box here, but the research has shown that because of those things that were shared, events and things that were happening, there are core values that each generation also shares. And those are often the things that we see and hear about in the workplace. And so I'll walk you through first some of the things that help shape each generation, and then we'll talk about the core values. So for the traditionalist generation, certainly the World War had a significant impact on this generation. The stock market crash, the Great Depression. So there were some pretty significant events, heavy duty type of events that occurred during the traditionalist formative years. And when we get to the next slide where I talk about core values, you'll see the correlation between how those events shaped their generation. Then with baby boomers, certainly when you ask a baby boomer things that they remember from when they were growing up, they mention things like, the Vietnam War, JFK, Martin Luther King assassinations, the whole civil rights movement, Woodstock, and the family unit tending to be a large, family where, they were sharing or passing hand-me-downs or things like that. So that's the baby boomers. Gen X, the Gulf War certainly helped to shape and influence this generation. We had Watergate, we had the Challenger explosion, starting to see some things change in the workplace. Gen X was seeing their parents start to experience layoffs, downsizing, so loss of kind of that stability within business, and then high levels of divorce from a Gen X perspective. In the US, 50% of Gen Xers are from divorced families. And so that certainly helped to shape some of their preferences and behaviors. And then with millennials, Desert Storm, the Columbine shootings, terrorism, and certainly the whole technology boom, the internet, the way that technology is used to, buy, make purchases, communicate, things like that, and, more diversity in the family unit. And then with Gen Z, we're still, getting to know Gen Z a little bit as they're the newest entrants, but certainly social media has had a huge influence on Generation Z. It started with the millennials and continues today. 9/11, that really happened during the millennial generation. So, but it also has influenced just Gen Z in terms of, being aware of those types of events, and that something like that can occur, and, safety issues. A lot of high levels of education with Generation Z, and we're starting to see more and more multi-generational households where, either grandparents are living with the family, or, children staying at home longer or coming home maybe after they graduate from college, things like that. So those are just some of the events that help shape each generation. So let's now talk about the core values of each generation. So for traditionalists, remember we talked about some of those heavy-duty events that took place. So traditionalists, some of their core values are certainly things like, hard work and dedication to their employer. They have a tremendous amount of respect for authority. So many of them were, in the military or worked in government types of positions, or were in organizations where, the organizational hierarchy was well known and respected. They tend to be very loyal in terms of, organizations that they work for, loyal in terms of brands that they buy, and are very much about, fulfilling their responsibilities before they really do anything for themselves. For baby boomers, team orientation is very important to them. They are very relationship focused. So in work environments, they focus a lot on, building relationships with their peers and colleagues, as well as with customers, and really ensuring that there's a customer focus. Personal growth is something that has been important to them throughout their lives. And like their traditionalist parents, they have a very strong work ethic and are very dedicated to employers and businesses within which they work. Gen X, as I mentioned, in the U.S., that large percentage of Gen Xers that are from divorced families, so they tend to be very self-reliant, function more independently. You may have heard of the term latchkey kids. That was a concept that was brought up in the Gen X years, where they were, going home from school, many of them, to either a household where both parents were working or a single parent household. So they had to, take on responsibilities for themselves or maybe some of their siblings. And so they tend to be very independent. They like a more informal, creative, fun type of work environment. And Gen X was the generation that really started to challenge organizations around this whole concept of work-family balance, and really start to demand that they needed more flexibility and more balance in their lives. And we've seen all of the generations benefit from that now. So with the millennial generation, I mentioned technology, and certainly that has been a heavy, as a core value, and it's been a heavy influence on the millennials, but also on the other generations as well. Millennials have, very focused on achievement. If any of you have either been through the college, application process, or maybe had a child that's gone through it recently, there are a lot of things that this generation has accomplished by very young ages. And so that's something that is very important to them. It's a core value of theirs. They tend to be more global in nature, think more globally, and like to come up with new ideas and new ways of doing things. And then Gen Z, as I said, we're still trying to figure them out a bit, learn more about them as they get into the workplace more. But many Gen Zs tend to have a very entrepreneurial type of spirit. We've certainly seen numerous reports and stories over the past few years about, young children starting their own companies. More and more colleges and universities are dedicating programs to different types of entrepreneurial experiences and how to gain that type of background and knowledge before even graduating. They tend to be, what we're seeing, a little bit more pragmatic, and the privacy thing, it seems like they may have learned some things from their millennial brothers, sisters, cousins, in terms of how much information you really put out there and where you put that information. And so we're starting to see just some changes in some of the social media norms related to that. So, and of course, they can also filter very large batches of information. So they're used to a lot of things coming at them, and they seem to have a strength and a value around that as well. So as I said, the research has shown that what was happening during each generation's formative years helps to shape some of these core values and these key attributes. And these are the things that are often the strengths or the core competencies that we see in the workforce and in the workplace. So let's take a pause here, and it would be interesting just to see, what generations we have on the webinar today. And we'd like to know which generation you associate with or you're from. So we're not checking IDs, as we're on the phone. So, but we'd like to see that. And I think I have to, let's see.
No,
Must
you're good.
do I have to do anything?
No,
Is it running?
it's running. We're collecting
Okay.
information. We have
Excellent.
almost 80% of our participants have voted, but there's still more coming in. So
okay.
We seem to be in kind of the Gen X millennial fighting for the first place at the moment. All right. Well, the numbers seem to have held for a moment, so I want to publish the results for you, and fingers crossed that I do this right. Let's see. Do we see the poll results? There we go. I see them. Is everyone else seeing them?
I'm not seeing them.
All right. Well, would it be okay if I just share
seeing the
them?
PowerPoint. Yeah. Can you tell us?
Sure. So we have no traditionalists. I think they must be out getting the early bird specials. We have 25% baby boomers, 40% Gen X, 33% millennials, and in there with 1% Gen Z.
Excellent. Okay. So not surprising that we don't have any traditionalists. I mean, traditionalists today are really making up only 1 to 2% of the workforce. And but yet they still have an important role to play, and I think that's something that's really important to mention. And many of them, still influence in organizations. So they may have been the founder of a company, or they may be a key patent holder. And some of our like pharmaceutical companies, we see that where they're a key patent holder, and so they still are influence some of the research and development activities that are going on, or maybe they sit on the board. So they still have an important role to play. Baby boomers, we are starting to see the shift as more and more baby boomers start to leave organizations. And this is presenting some challenges from an organizational standpoint in terms of transferring. They're leaving with some critical skills and knowledge. So ensuring that information gets transferred to the other generations. Gen X, moving more into leadership roles and continuing to make up a large population. And then certainly we're seeing anywhere from, I would say, a third to a half of the workforce represented by the millennial generation now. It's projected that 50% of the workforce will be millennials by 2020. So we're getting pretty close. So those numbers are about what I was expecting. And as I mentioned, this is really what's happening, and two of the key things that are influencing this topic to be more critical to businesses and even in academic setting, as they're seeing shifts as well. But first of all, we're seeing the population. The world is getting older. There's no question about that. And the average age in the U.S. in 1970 was 28. In 2019, it's 38. So that the population is aging, and also people are staying in the workplace longer. We're living longer. We want to continue to contribute longer, and so that in itself also just raises some challenges in terms of how to manage the multiple generations and their different needs, and to continue to grow and develop the younger generations as either the older generations transition out or stay for longer. And then, as I said, more and more millennials entering, so 50% by 2020, and by 2025, it's estimated that 75% of the U.S. workforce will be millennials. And so this is a topic that, recently we've just been hearing more and more about in terms of our clients. And one of the big things is challenges related to millennial retention, and the fact that millennials do change jobs. So 21% of millennials have changed jobs in the past year, and millennials also seem to be more open to considering different jobs and different opportunities. So it is presenting just some additional challenges related to, what can you do to retain them, as it can be expensive, as employees turn over frequently. So let me share some demographic data since we're talking about these demographic shifts. These are from 2 pharma companies that we work with. And you can see company A, there's no traditionalist. 50% of their workforce is made up of Generation X, 36% millennial. They do have some Gen Zs entering, and baby boomers at 12%. And then, so pretty similar to some of the numbers that we saw in our poll. And then company B, they actually have a much larger percentage of millennials. So they have 66% of their workforce is millennials. And then 14% baby boomers, 16% Xers, and just a few percent traditionalists. And in this case, 90% of their workforce has less than 4 years of experience. So, experience with the company, then that is, can be very challenging for the organization. And they're also seeing, these turnover challenges. So lots of things that those demographics, cause companies to experience, but also to figure out, what to do about it. Here's another example with one of our financial services clients, and this just shows the shift in their data from, over the last 7 years. So in 2012, you can see that 49% of their workforce was baby boomers, and in 2019, it's 29%. So they're really starting to see those baby boomers start to retire and leave, and they've been doing a lot of work around, as I said, transitioning some of that knowledge and experience, and also some of their customer relationships to ensure that they're bringing the other generations in to help build those relationships before some of the key relationship holders leave. And you can see that their Gen X population has stayed about the same, but their millennial population has more than tripled over the past 7 years, going from 11% to 35%. So again, as I said earlier, I think that's really why we're starting to hear more and more about this topic, because these demographic shifts are definitely happening, and they're causing companies to really have to think about their cultures, their leadership, and many other things related to these multi-generations in the workplace. So the business impact, there's lots of different ways that we're seeing us impact business. The first is from a recruiting standpoint. Each generation has different things that attract them to a company. So, it used to be, I used to work for Mobil Oil Corporation in their recruiting function many years ago, and we used to pretty much give the same messages to everybody that we were trying to attract to the company about, why they should come work for us. But in today's world, each generation, each individual is looking for different things. And so it's really important that your employee value proposition is targeted towards the different generations, that, your recruiting materials, your marketing materials, your website, when different generations go there or are reading your information, they are seeing things that are resonating with them and that are important to them. Retention, as I mentioned, millennial retention is certainly a challenge, but just retention in general. Each generation has different things that cause them to stay with organizations, and so we're seeing more and more of our clients put retention strategies in place. We've seen a lot of clients over the past couple of years start to implement things like stay interviews, where they're having leaders, really have discussions with their employees around, what is causing them to stay with the company, what can they do to ensure that they, are having their needs met and want to stay with the company. So a lot of movement there from a talent management, talent retention standpoint. Certainly culture, if you think about it, especially in larger companies that have been around for a long time, their cultures were built by traditionalists and baby boomers. And so some of the core values and things that have been established within the culture that are associated with those generations may need to be tweaked a bit, or cultures may need to be modified to make sure that they are cultures that are attractive to all of the generations and that are, places that each generation wants to come and work and stay. The knowledge transfer, I've mentioned that this is a really critical issue as baby boomers leave, and ensuring that knowledge gets transferred down, relationships gets transferred down to the other generation, so that you're not losing all of that critical information and those critical skills. And then certainly from an engagement standpoint, we calculated that out. Their estimated cost a year is $348,000. So that can have a pretty significant impact to a bottom line. It's estimated at that level of the organization, it's about 20% of the annual salary it costs in when an employee turns over. Financial services company is another example. And this, is costing them more than, $500,000 a year for their turnover. And that number increases, as you get to more senior levels of the organization. So this is just one example of how some of these generational issues can impact the business's bottom line, and why it's really critical to make sure that you're addressing these issues. So let's take another poll question here. Curious to see, based on those areas that I mentioned where businesses are seeing the impact, what are you seeing in your organizations or your workplaces around how generational preferences are impacting you?
Great.
So Margaret, is the poll open?
The poll is open. We're already getting quite a bit of participation, so thank you, everyone. And I did set it up so that you could select all that apply, not just pick one, because it's very likely that this is impacting you in multiple ways. Good. We have a tie with retaining talent and culture, but everything else is pretty close. All right.
Okay.
Last call for everybody to participate. I'm going to close and publish it. Okay. And I know from a previous time that you had trouble seeing it, Kim, but everyone else was able to. So do you want me to read the results again?
Yeah, sure. For some reason, I don't know why, but I'm not seeing the results.
Okay. Well, the good news is that
that'd be great.
Yeah, the audience can see that, and so can I. So attracting talent had 31%, retaining talent had 54%, transfer of knowledge had 50%, culture 56%, and engagement 44%.
Wow. Okay. So across the board, all of those issues are impacting. And when we get to the Q&A section, I'd love to hear more about from you if anyone's willing to share just where exactly how you're experiencing them.
There already are some questions to that effect, so we'll definitely be able to address them.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Okay, good. So I do want to say, it's not all about the differences. A lot of times when we talk about this topic, we focus on the differences because certainly it's important from a diversity perspective, to understand, where there are differences between the generations and to understand their core values and what's helped shape them. But there are also things that the generations share in common. And we did some focus groups about 2 years back to try and find out, where are the true differences and where are the things that the generations share in common. And from a commonality standpoint, we found that, everyone wants to be respected. Everyone wants to contribute to the place that they work in some way, and everyone wants to add value. And so I think that if we can come from a place of, there are things that we share in common, and those are 3 really important things to each of us as individuals, that we can come to appreciate that and not focus, but then at the same time respect that we do have differences and, the tremendous strengths that each generation brings to the workplace, and, how if you leverage those strengths, you can really have a significant impact on, the workplace, the culture, and ultimately the business results. So it's really about, this isn't an us versus them. And a lot of times when I'm doing presentations, I hear this, it's the baby boomers versus the millennials, or the Gen X's are against the baby boomers. No, we're really talking about how do we, use this information to build, a strong team and have a positive impact on businesses and workplaces. And to do that, it's also really important to know that what's important to each generation. Where are they, based on those core values, as you're working with them, as you're communicating with them, as you're approaching them from maybe your client standpoint or students that you have, what's important for each generation. And I think this is another one of those things that as you're, interacting with others in the workplace, if you kind of take a step back and think about, well, where's this person coming from? And how can I use that to have a more effective relationship or a more effective, communication with them. So for traditionalists, think back on some of the things that we talked about in terms of what's happened during their lifetime and their core values. Things that are important to them, tend to be more around, having like a formal process and feeling respected. They certainly have a tremendous amount of experience, and they want their knowledge and experience to be appreciated. They really like to understand the data behind, decisions and when things are changing, and help to understand the why behind change and why change is necessary. Quality from a product and service standpoint is very important to them. And, as I said, they have a lot of knowledge and experience, so they do tend to rely on what's worked in the past, or when they've tried things in the past, what they've experienced from that. And then, the company function, reputation, brand, as I mentioned earlier, they're very brand loyal, so that's very important to them. Baby boomers, they too are looking for respect from their experience. I've talked to several baby boomers in the workplace today, and they often are feeling like they're not as valued. And, they're seeing as more and more millennials enter, there's a focus on, developing millennials, developing Gen Xers. And so baby boomers are sitting there saying, wow, we've got all of this experience that, still can add value to the organization. And so they really want to be respected for that. And they want to continue to be part of, the future of the company and helping to shape that. Baby boomers, as I mentioned earlier, are very relationship oriented, so they do tend to look for that personal connection, and they like the more individualized and customized attention. And they like to have time to ask questions, voice their opinions, engage in dialogue. And from a feedback standpoint, they like to receive feedback more as part of the normal process. What they've been used to in their career is probably the more formal performance management type of process, where they may be getting feedback from their boss, once or twice a year as part of a process, or when there's really a problem or concern. Gen Xers, what's important to them is really respecting their time. As I mentioned, they are very focused on their work and personal balance, and so, respecting their time. They like to interact with people that they feel have a high level of competence and knowledge and subject matter expertise. Gen Xers tend to be pretty direct in their communication. Sometimes people think that Gen Xers can come off as rude because they're very direct, but it is truly for many Gen Xers, it's part of their communication style. They like information, data to back it up. They like to share new ideas, collaborate, brainstorm, and they like to be in an environment where there's an openness and acceptance to that. And certainly, use of technology is important. And they like to receive feedback on a more regular basis, but they like their feedback more focused on the constructive feedback or developmental type of feedback. And then millennials, respect for their knowledge. So millennials are the highest educated generation, and so they like to be respected for the knowledge and information that they bring. They like to help influence decisions. They have a lot of knowledge about trends and what's going on, how technology is being leveraged, and so certainly they add a lot of value from sharing that information. They like to spend time on creating new ideas and thinking of new ways of doing things, and they tend to like options that are fast, easy, and convenient. And from a feedback standpoint, millennials do like to receive feedback on a more frequent basis. They really look to have a more continuous dialogue with their leader that provides them with guidance and also, what's working and what they can do better. So as I said, understanding and thinking about what's important to each generation can really help in terms of engaging them and, having more effective types of communication and dialogue. So let me share with you some of the things that we're seeing companies do to address the generational preferences and demographic shifts, and really focused on, 4 key areas. The first is, education, and just having some conversations around generational preferences and what organizations are seeing in terms of the generational preferences of their employees, but also their clients. We just worked with a financial services firm who we were having conversations with their client services group about some of the things that they were seeing as their clients, who are primarily traditionalists and baby boomers, start to engage the Gen Xers and millennials in their families, for example, in more decisions about, the family wealth and having more influence on those decisions that are made. So this firm is looking at changing some of the things they did to make sure that they were engaging all of the generations in the family. But they're having, many organizations are having more cross-generational dialogues and forums to share information, brainstorm ideas about, what they're seeing and hearing about and how they can leverage that information. Using different types of communication channels to get information out. And having some discussions about decision making and what levels of the organization does decision making take place, and how to make sure that people are aware of the decision making processes and where there's flexibility and ultimately who's accountable for different types of decisions that get made. Knowledge transfer. that was an area that many of you said you were experiencing in your organizations, and we're seeing more and more companies start to really think more strategically about the transfer of knowledge and not just assume that it will happen through informal processes, but really building more structured process for transfer of knowledge, starting to introduce clients, customers to younger employees earlier on, engaging millennials to help build customer relationships based on some of the knowledge and experience they have around technology, and even doing some reverse mentoring where they're having millennials mentor, baby boomers, for example, as new technologies are being, implemented in companies, and when they need to get adopted, leveraging some of the millennial knowledge and experience around technology and helping baby boomers and others leverage that technology. From a culture standpoint, using different types of technologies. I mean, certainly digital transformation is a huge area right now, so there's a lot of technologies being implemented to gain efficiencies and work differently, interact with customers differently. Many organizations who do engagement surveys are starting to look at their results by generation to see if there are things that the data shows around some of these generational differences and preferences that they can build in to ensure that all of their employees are engaged, hosting leadership team roundtable discussions and creating opportunities for more upward feedback from the millennial and Gen Xers to maybe more of the senior leaders in the organization. And then recruiting and retention, continuing to leverage internship programs. Our one client, when they looked at their turnover data, found that when they had millennials who had internships with them, they had no turnover within 3 years from those employees. But when they were millennials who entered the organization and had not had experience with them, they had much higher turnover rates. So, really leveraging those internship programs to expose people to the culture and use that as a recruiting tool. Increasing transparency around, compensation and how compensation decisions are made, and then really engaging employees in defining career paths and development opportunities to look at, new ways of doing things and kind of get new ideas that some of the younger employees may have around how they can be developed and what paths they follow within organizations. So here's a couple of strategies you can use to really harness what I call the generational power, because as I said, having 3, 4, 5 generations in your workplace really can be powerful if you're leveraging the strengths. So first of all, it's about celebrating the differences. Really think about who are you interacting with on a regular basis? What generation might they be from? And where might you experience things where you're stereotyping from a generational perspective, and what could you do differently? Invest the time. I always say you have to spend time to save time. And I think especially when you're a leader in an organization, by getting to know your employees on an individual basis and what is it that really motivates and inspires them, can ultimately help you save time down the road. So, think about where you're spending your time and, how you might use your understanding of the generations and their preferences to leverage time even more. And then really understanding the strengths of the people around you, having those conversations, and thinking about the different generations you have on your team. What strengths do they bring, and how can you use them to impact the objectives and goals that you have within your organization? Demonstrating respect and understanding that for each individual, what respect looks like is different. And so what you might think of as respect and what they might think of could be 2 different things. So, just understanding how you demonstrate respect to others and what type of response do you get in asking people, what respect looks like. And then also thinking about where there are opportunities to include people in meetings or in projects or things that you might not have thought of before or might not have included before. And then really it's about paying attention. What are you doing and what might you do differently to really, improve your communications and the way that you're interacting with all of the different generations in your workplace. So each generation has something that they want to give an organization, what they're looking to get, and ultimately every organization has something to gain by maximizing all of these different generations. So hopefully this gave you some things to consider as part of the workplaces that you're in, and you can use this information going forward. And I thank you all for your time, and I think we still do have time for some questions.
Oh, Kim, that was a great presentation, very informative, and it did generate some discussion in the question section. I want to start off with a question that was about baby boomers. There are some questions about some other generations as well, but I'll start off with this one about, they're exiting the workplace in droves, but the question was, are they being offered buyouts, or are they able to make a decision on their own about retiring by choice?
I think that really depends. We're seeing a little bit of everything. So certainly there are still some organizations that are going through downsizing, and so they're offering opportunities for employees to volunteer. And typically you would see, maybe your baby boomers who had been thinking about retiring within the next few years anyway, take advantage of that. Then we're also seeing, some organizations where they're having some baby boomers who are starting to move into different roles, or maybe even move to a part-time capacity, while they figure out their transition plan. And then, some baby boomers are just flat out choosing to retire on their own. So I would say it's a little bit of, all of those things, really depending on, the company and what's going on from a business perspective.
And I think this next question may be a little bit related to the reason for the first, which was asking if, one of the generational differences being resistance and embracing change. Do you think that baby boomers are resistant to change and fear failure of the type of innovative ideas that are suggested by millennials, which then kind of alienates the millennial generation?
So the question, I think, is because many organizations are going through a lot of change, and pretty much in every industry, that's all you hear about, right? Is change, change, change. Is that maybe forcing baby boomers to think about, what value they add, and if they want to stay in organizations because of the amount of change and the type of change they're going through. And again, it's hard to, I don't want to just generalize, because it really depends. Mm-hmm. I know that, baby boomers, are often thought of to be resistant to change, but when you talk to baby boomers, they will say that they're not, it's not necessarily that they're resistant, but they just often feel like they don't have the understanding of why the change is happening and how the impact that it has on them personally, but also to their customers and the relationships that they have. So I think a lot of times it's also just a communication issue. Mm-hmm. Of ensuring that, you think about how individuals react and respond to change, and what you can do to kind of engage them in the process early on, that might help them feel more comfortable and provide more buy-in to the change overall. But baby boomers still have a critical role in organizations because oftentimes they've seen, different things tried, and they can add that knowledge of what the experience has been in the past. Not to say, well, we've been there and done that, we shouldn't do it again, but just to provide that perspective and help the organization think about, well, what were the learnings from that and what might we do differently to ensure that this is successful if it wasn't in the past.
So the next question is a really interesting one, and it's around generation, qualities associated with, the generations versus personality type. And there were some references in the question to things like Myers-Briggs and DISC. So the question was asking which wins, personality or generation?
Well, I think there are multiple things that make up each of us, right? And this generational piece is really one component. I mean, if you think about diversity, right, really what we're talking here is about age and how that impacts us from a diversity standpoint. So, we have lots of different diversity components that make up each of us, and personality is one, age is one, gender, our ethnicity, our backgrounds, the cultures that we come from. So all of these different components make up each of us as individuals. And so personality is certainly one component of that, but it doesn't kind of trump one or the other, I would say, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah. So I wanted to get to some of the millennial oriented questions. And one was, are millennials walking away from the kind of jobs that have pensions, or are they feeling more portable because they have things like 401ks?
It's interesting. I moderated a panel of millennials recently, and I asked each of the millennials, what's one of the stereotypes that you hear about your generation that you want to debunk, right? And one of the millennials said that the fact that they hear a lot about, they're not looking for stability or longer term. And this millennial said, that's important to us. I mean, we're coming out with a lot of student debt. So, those components of the employment package are important, but at the same time, there's other things that are really important that we would give preference to over that stability, whereas another generation might not. And so, for example, they talked about, lack of development opportunities, and, that if they don't feel like there's opportunity for them to continue to learn and grow, even though they feel like it may be a stable environment or they could stay in their job for a long time, they might be more likely to look at other options. Another one they said was just, misalignment between the company and their own personal values. And so, they again said, while there might be a stability is important and we might be in a stable environment, if we feel like, there's some misalignment between what's important to my own personal values and the direction that the company is taking, then I might be more likely to leave. So, I would say, it is an individual decision, but I think that those are some of the things that certainly come into consideration when millennials think about leaving organizations.
So someone else asked about the expectation of promotions from the millennials and their workforce, and they said that they don't know how to address the fact that they want a promotion every 6 months or so.
Yeah, I think that is, the millennials that we talk to and have done focus groups say that it's not, that is something that they hear a lot of, they feel like that's a stereotype, organizations feel like all we want to do is get promoted. And what they would say is we want to be developed. And so, it doesn't necessarily have to be, that I'm getting promoted per se, but they want to see what the path looks like, what the opportunities are. And I know this is difficult. I've talked to a lot of leaders that have said, you know, this is challenging for me. My millennial employees are wanting me to lay out like this career path for them, and often I can't do that. So that's where when I said some organizations are starting to do, like, have more conversations, engaging millennials around, you know, what are the different options? And it may not necessarily be a clear-cut career path, but even sharing, having other generations of employees share, you know, what their career path was, or, you know, different types of development assignments that they've been given exposure to that have helped them in their career. So I think it's really just being more willing to have those conversations, then and to help the millennials understand that there are developmental options within the organization, and that they can have, you know, some say, some participation in that process, can really be helpful.
Okay, good. Let me tie into another question that we received just in the last few minutes, which was asking about the basis for saying that the millennial generation is the most educated. And it sounds like these development opportunities play into it, in addition to things like college, MBAs, advanced degrees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, the data shown that just the number of millennials that have bachelor's degree, and if not bachelor's advanced degrees, is much higher than other generations. And so, you know, they're coming into organizations with a lot of knowledge. The academic experiences that they've gotten, including internships and things like that, have given them, you know, some great tools and experiences to start out with. And, you know, so I think that that's all certainly coming into play, and that they do feel like they're entering organizations with something to contribute, not just, you know, necessarily another set of hands, but they want their experience and their knowledge and their education to be utilized.
Well, that's great. I have a few more questions that I'd like to share with you offline, if that's okay. I want to be respectful of everyone's time and close out here on a timely basis. But if you didn't hear an answer to your question, I'd, you know, and you're on the line with us, Kim, would you mind doing a few follow-ups, or maybe a blog on, you know, some common elements, just to make sure we address everyone's questions from today?
Sure, absolutely.
Oh,
Happy to
thank
do
you.
that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And Kim, thank you so much to all of our participants. Thank you so much. We really had a great discussion on a really important and emerging topic today. So I have a friendly reminder to those of you who are interested in our virtual Lunch and Learn series that these are monthly events. You can, I refer to meet us in the middle, meaning that they take place in the middle of each month, the middle of each week of that week, and the middle of the day. For more information, you can visit our website, which is business.rutgers.edu/alumni/lifelong-learning. We have an exciting schedule of topics and speakers in the coming months, but are also open to your suggestions. So please stay tuned as this webinar closes, because you'll receive a very brief 3-question survey about the webinar itself, and there'll be a free-form field for you to type in suggestions for future topics. I mentioned earlier, but since a few questions came in on this topic, I'll mention again that a link to the archive recording of this presentation will be sent to you very soon, and it can also be found on our Business Insights page on our website. So thanks everyone, enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next month.